I'm just going to look at the EU ETS emissions. For a quick bit of background, you may or may not be quite familiar with the EU ETS. Well, the EPA is the competent authority for administration of the emissions trading system in Ireland since it was introduced in 2005. We have a number of operators. We call them stationary installations if they're industry based in Ireland, and then we have the aviation industry. There are a number of aircraft operators that are assigned to Ireland to administer their emissions, and there are only 7 who have reported to us last year, but that was unusual. We would normally have maybe 15 or so reporting to us under the Aviation EU ETS. So on the stationary side, it's 105 stationary installations, and I'll mainly be focusing on the emissions from that area. They consist of power generation, cement, alumina, food industries, data centres, other construction products, and pharmachem. And the aviation is both commercial and non-commercial. The number goes up and down even in the stationary installations because of companies closing down and new companies closing up and people falling below the threshold. So what happened in 2020? You've heard Stephen's summary of the overall emissions from the country. It was no different in EU ETS. There were 13.29 million tonnes of CO2 reported by the stationary installations, which was a drop of 6.1% compared to 2019 levels. And on the aviation side, there was a dramatic drop of 63%. So really, it's mainly power gen emissions that have dropped most. They've dropped by 8.1%. Overall, the non-power gen emissions dropped by 3.5%. That includes the industrial companies, 2 hospitals, the data centres, etc. The cement sector in particular showed a noticeable drop of 5.8%. And the dairy sector increased by 4%. And on the pharmaceutical side, that's both those producing bulk pharmaceutical chemicals and the pharmaceutical finished products that are included in the EU ETS, some of them, they increased their emissions by 10.9%. So we'll look in more detail during the presentation at these different areas. Just by way of contrast, EU-wide, there was a drop of 11.4%. So our drop of 6.1% was modest compared to the drop across the EU. So it looks a bit better when you look at the long-term trend. The initial 22.4 million tonnes coming from the ETS sector in 2005 has dropped dramatically to 13.29 million tonnes in 2020. That's a reduction of 40.8%. And the EU reduction over the same period was 33%. The most significant reduction, as you've heard us say, was in the electricity generation sector, a reduction of 50.3% or 7.6 million tonnes. Other significant reductions were in the cement sector. There was a drop of 30.5%. Looking in more detail at the industries in particular, you can see here that there have been different phases in the EU ETS, and so there also we've gone through recessions. So there are different factors driving down the emissions. Overall, some operators haven't really changed their emissions, some sectors, but in areas such as cement and alumina production, that's the green and the blue on this chart, you can see that there are reductions, and that reduction of 30% in the cement sector in particular. Just a little bit more about the whole process of the EU ETS. You can see here that there are 3 phases. Sorry, we're in the 4th phase now, so there have been 3 phases. The pilot phase was 2005 to 2007. And then the second trading period, which corresponded to Kyoto period 1, was from 2008 to 2012. Now, both of those periods, there was a free allocation to both the power gen industry and to industrial sectors, and it was done on a grandfathering basis, and it was done nationally. So Ireland had its national allocation plan, and the UK or France had their national allocation plan. They were scrutinised for fairness by the EU Commission, but really it was up to individual member states to decide what was the best way to allocate. And this led to a lot of over allocation. It wasn't entirely just bad planning, it was also because recession came in 2008, 2009, and the emissions then were a lot less than had been expected. And the allocation, as I said, was based on grandfathering or what historical emissions. So with phase 3 in 2013, that all changed. First of all, power generation, all electricity generation got no free allocation. They had to go to the market to buy allowances and pass the costs of the carbon through to their customers. And the other industries got free allocation, but it was based on EU-wide benchmarks. So that was quite a change. The EU-wide benchmarks are calculated using the average emission level of the 10% most efficient installations within each sector. And there was also a linear reduction factor across the period, driving the cap downwards. So for phase 4, which commenced in January of this year, those benchmarks have been revised again to look at technological progress in each of the sectors and see if they should be changed. And so free allocation will be reduced further during this phase. The cap is also declining more rapidly. It's declining in phase 4 by 2.2% per annum. So I'm just contrasting here on this chart the same idea, the verified emissions versus the free allocation. And in Ireland, you'll see that the verified emissions in the first pilot phase were actually higher than the free allocation. So we didn't over allocate in Ireland in the first phase. But because of the impact of the recession, there was over allocation for the second trading period. And then as we, like everyone else in the EU or the EEA rather, we have been implementing the EU-wide rules on free allocation for phase 3 and phase 4, and the verified emissions have been substantially higher than the actual allocation. So looking a bit more deeply at the different sectors in phase 3, you can see here that the decline in emissions is very much mirrored by the decline in the power gen emissions. The price of carbon is in the dotted red line there, and that has risen sharply as the demand for allowances increases due to the lower level of free allocation and to the fact that the Commission introduced something in 2019 called the Market Stability Reserve, which withdraws allowances from the market if there are too many in circulation. And even the anticipation of that event, even though it didn't start until 2019, it already started to drive up the prices as people, are buying allowances for future use. The cement sector is our next highest emitter after the power gen as a total sector, and as we said, that their emissions are down. It may be partly due to less carbon intensive fuels. There's also a drop in 2020 compared to 2019, that less cement was produced because of the lockdown and some of the cement plants being closed for some of the time. Some of them were still able to keep going because so much of the controls can be done remotely. So we looked at the intensity of the carbon intensity of the clinker production and averaged the carbon intensity across the 4 Irish cement plants. So we find that between 2014 and 2020, there is a decrease. There's a drop in the carbon intensity of over 4% across the period. And the basis for the revised benchmarks in phase 4 is the EU-wide, it is the 10% best across the EEA. And that figure has been published by the European Commission this summer, and it's 0.722. That's achieved in 2016, 2017 by the 10% most efficient installations across the EEA. So the Irish plants compared to that have still a long way to go in terms of achieving that level of low carbon intensity for every tonne of clinker. And I don't know exactly what the most efficient plants are using, but I suppose that they must be using perhaps more waste-derived fuels, etc. And they may have more efficient plant, because of course the newer the plant, the more efficient it's likely to be. I mean, when we've recorded the average there for the 4 installations, but there is a variation between some of the plants that are using less carbon intensive fuels and are more efficient because they are perhaps newer plants as well. Just in terms of allocation versus emissions for the cement sector, cement sector has always been accused of taking a windfall, but in Ireland this has been certainly tightened in phase 3. So the allocation by EU-wide benchmarks began in 2013, and you can see that there is a tightening of the gap between verified emissions and freely allocated allowances. Other sectors, it's more difficult to see what is driving the emissions. In some cases, there is a definite increase over the period. For example, in the pharmachem and the dairies, and even in all the food and drink sector, there is an increase in emissions. In some cases, we know that there has been fuel switching driven by the price of carbon. So some installations in the dairy sector, for example, that were using heavy fuel oil or coal have switched over to using natural gas. The alumina plant has switched over to using natural gas, where previously they were using coal for some of the processes. So we also know that in some cases, pharmachem plants may be producing more electricity on site using CHP plants, and this will drive up the emissions as we see them coming from the individual installation, but it's still to be welcomed because it's more efficient, it reduces transmission losses, and it should be a more efficient way of producing the electricity as well as reducing demand on the national grid. But it will be recorded as an increase in their overall emissions coming from the site. So just briefly, I want to look at the aviation emissions, and they are administered by us. That includes the large airlines like Ryanair, Aer Lingus, ASL Cargo, etc. But of course, all the emissions are not arising as a result of flights coming in or going out of Ireland. Ryanair has many hubs across Europe, but because they are a registered airline in Ireland, they come under our administration. And so what this graph is showing is all the emissions that are administered by Ireland, and it's a worrying increase in international aviation, as was mentioned previously by Stephen. And just you can really ignore the fact that there's a drop between 2012 and 2013, because initially all flights throughout the world emanating from the EEA were to be covered, and then that couldn't be implemented satisfactorily, so the EU Commission reduced the scope. So it's from 2013 onwards that we really need to look at the trend, and it was just increasing year on year as the cost of air travel went down and people had more opportunities to travel, until of course COVID came along, and the drop was dramatic at 63%. And the number of planes on the ground across Europe since March 2020 has never been as high. Eurocontrol have published this data, and you can see that normally it would be in about 1,500 planes on the ground as a weekly average, and suddenly it jumped to 7,000 as a result of the first lockdown. And it is gradually recovering. Now it's about 2,600 on the ground, which is still a lot more than pre-COVID. So the recovery is there, is gradual, and we can also see it in air traffic numbers. This is also Eurocontrol data. So the blue line, the pale blue line, is the 2019 emissions as a reference point. 2019 air traffic, and the current darker blue line is the current level of air traffic. And so the difference is gradually decreasing, and it's now less than 30%. And I can tell you that if you want to get into this kind of data, you can see it all on the Eurocontrol website, and some airlines like Ryanair would be much closer to their 2019 levels in terms of actual numbers of flights. Now, that doesn't mean that there's the same amount of people on them, but the flights are increasing. But I would expect that emissions from aviation will still be very much down for 2021, because as you can see, the recovery is only kicking in July or so, and that will still have an impact on the emissions from aviation. I suppose the flip side of the fact that there have been less people traveling is that we're all at home, and you heard already that we've increased our need for heating oil because we can't get out there to the Spanish sunshine. So just to conclude then, overall in terms of the EU ETS emissions, they have reduced. Power generation is the most noticeable. There have been improvements in other areas. Particularly, we can see that in the cement industry and in other industries, there also has been fuel switching. The outlook is that, carbon prices are going to remain very high or even creep higher. They're currently just under €60 per tonne, and they may get, even higher, especially if there are other sectors brought into emissions trading. The Innovation Fund is an opportunity there to adopt new technologies. It's a fund that's financed from the auctioning of 450 million allowances under the EU ETS from 2020 to 2030, and it's there are calls that come out periodically for large and small scale projects focusing on innovative low carbon technologies and processes in energy intensive industries, including products substituting carbon intensive ones, carbon capture and utilization. And it's to be hoped that Irish industry will also get involved in the Innovation Fund. The previous fund, which was analogous to this, was the NER 300, and there was only a very small amount of interest from Irish energy companies, but this one is wider. It's available to both industry and to the energy sector, and it's to be hoped that people will get involved, and the Department of the Environment have a help desk to help Irish industry to get involved in the uptake of that. And yes, the EU ETS is likely to expand. Maritime is the most likely one to be brought in soon, and then there's possibilities of other sectors as well being included. So thanks very much for your attention. Like Stephen, I direct you to the website, our EU EPA website, for information on EU emissions trading. It's the EU ETS is actually under the licensing pages, so that's the URL there. And the other interesting place, if you want to look at trends across Europe and in individual countries, is on the European Environment Agency's website. They have what's called the EUTL data viewer, which takes data from the Union Registry, where all emissions and allocations are recorded. And that's the address for that.